The BRICS nations are challenging the global balance of power, and Vladimir Putin has warned that the world may be entering the most dangerous decade since the end of World War II. As geopolitical tensions continue to rise, major economic alliances are being reshaped, global trade is evolving, and new investment opportunities are beginning to emerge. So, what is really happening behind the scenes, and which sectors could benefit from these historic changes? Let's dive in. BRICS is an alliance originally formed by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and later South Africa. These countries were brought together because of their rapidly growing economies, large populations, and increasing influence on global markets. Although nations like Mexico also have large populations and emerging economies, Mexico was not included because it was already a member of the OECD. Over the past decade, BRICS has steadily evolved from an economic discussion group into a strategic bloc seeking to increase its influence on the international stage. Its long-term objective is to provide an alternative to Western-led institutions such as the G7 and, to some extent, reshape the current global order. To understand why this matters, we first need to understand the difference between the G7 and the G20. The G7 was established during the 1970s and originally brought together the world's largest advanced economies. In 1998, Russia joined the group, turning it into the G8. However, following Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, it was removed, and the alliance returned to being the G7. The G20, created in 1999, expanded the conversation by including the world's major emerging economies alongside the G7 members and the European Union. Today, it has become the most important forum for discussing global economic policy and often carries greater economic significance than the G7 itself. Although every BRICS nation is also a member of the G20, participating in an organization is very different from leading one. Much like the United Nations includes almost every country while remaining heavily influenced by its institutional structure, the G20 still operates largely within a framework shaped by Western economies. This distinction has become increasingly important as geopolitical tensions continue to intensify. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, US President Joe Biden argued that Russia should be excluded from the G20. However, Indonesia, which held the rotating presidency at the time, refused to withdraw Putin's invitation, maintaining its policy of neutrality. Although Putin ultimately chose not to attend the summit, the controversy highlighted the growing divisions within the world's most influential economic forum. Around the same time, Putin declared that the era of a unipolar world was coming to an end. He argued that humanity was entering the most unpredictable and dangerous decade since World War II, claiming that Western nations could no longer govern the global system alone, and that many countries were no longer willing to accept a world dominated by a single power. Whether one agrees with this assessment or not, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The international balance of power is changing. Nations are reassessing old alliances, building new partnerships, and searching for greater economic independence in an increasingly uncertain world. Esta es una versión mucho más profesional, fluida y orientada a la retención de audiencia que una traducción literal del texto original. Continúa desarrollando las mismas ideas del archivo, pero con un estilo más natural y atractivo para un video en inglés. As tensions between Russia and the West continue to escalate, Moscow has begun accelerating a strategy that goes far beyond military or diplomatic conflict. Economic independence has become one of its highest priorities. Western sanctions have undoubtedly placed significant pressure on the Russian economy. However, according to the Kremlin, these restrictions have also forced the country to rebuild critical industries, manufacture products domestically that were once imported, and reduce its dependence on foreign suppliers. This approach moves Russia closer to what economists call economic self-sufficiency, or autarky, a system in which a nation attempts to produce as much as possible within its own borders instead of relying on imports. While becoming self-reliant may sound attractive in theory, achieving it is extremely difficult. Modern economies depend on complex global supply chains built over decades. Replacing imported technology, industrial components, and specialized manufacturing capabilities takes years of investment, skilled labor, and massive capital. Nevertheless, Russia believes the current geopolitical environment makes this transition necessary. But Moscow's ambitions extend beyond its own economy. Russia wants BRICS to evolve into a much stronger economic alliance, capable of reducing its dependence on Western financial institutions. One of its most ambitious proposals is replacing the US dollar in trade between BRICS members with a basket of their own national currencies. If implemented on a large scale, such a system could gradually reduce the dollar's dominance in international commerce. Russia has also proposed greater cooperation in strategic industries, including joint investments in oil refining, natural gas infrastructure, and energy production. These initiatives aim to strengthen economic ties among member countries while reducing their exposure to Western sanctions and financial systems. Interestingly, Russia's trade relationships within BRICS reveal another important trend. China and India have dramatically increased their purchases of discounted Russian oil and natural gas, taking advantage of lower prices created by Western sanctions. Brazil has continued importing large quantities of Russian fertilizers, which remain essential for its agricultural sector. South Africa, while less economically dependent on Russia than the other BRICS members, has also expressed interest in expanding trade to reduce domestic food and energy costs. In other words, despite political disagreements in many areas, economic incentives continue driving cooperation. Several BRICS nations have also experienced Western sanctions themselves in the past. South Africa faced decades of international sanctions during the apartheid era, while India encountered restrictions because of its nuclear weapons program. These historical experiences have influenced how many emerging economies view today's sanctions against Russia. Rather than seeing them as isolated events, some governments interpret them as reminders of how geopolitical disagreements can rapidly transform into economic pressure. As a result, many countries have become increasingly interested in building financial systems that are less dependent on Western institutions. This growing interest has sparked another major development. A number of influential nations, including Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Iran, Egypt, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Thailand, Nigeria, and Argentina, have either expressed interest in joining BRICS or have been publicly discussed as potential future members. If the alliance continues expanding, its combined population, natural resources, manufacturing capacity, and energy production would become even more significant, giving the bloc considerably greater influence over the global economy. However, despite its growing size and ambition, BRICS is far from being a perfectly unified alliance. Its members often disagree on major geopolitical issues, maintain competing strategic interests, and in some cases have long-standing territorial disputes. These internal divisions make BRICS both powerful and complicated. A coalition united by shared economic interests, but divided by very different political priorities. For that reason, the future of the alliance will depend not only on its economic strength, but also on whether its members can cooperate despite their competing national interests. Despite its growing influence, BRICS is not a unified political bloc. In fact, some of its members have competing interests that make deep cooperation far more complicated than it may appear. One of the clearest examples is the relationship between China and India. Although both countries are among the world's fastest-growing economies and cooperate within BRICS, they have spent decades competing for regional influence. Their unresolved border dispute in the Himalayas has fueled military tensions for more than 60 years, reminding the world that economic partnerships do not always eliminate geopolitical rivalries. India's foreign policy illustrates this balancing act perfectly. On one hand, India remains an active member of BRICS and continues strengthening economic ties with Russia. On the other hand, it has deepened its strategic partnerships with the United States, Japan, Australia, and several Indo-Pacific nations. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, for example, was created to strengthen economic cooperation across the Pacific region. While it includes India, the United States, Japan, Australia, and several other countries, China was deliberately excluded from the initiative. This reflects India's broader strategy, maintaining strong relationships with multiple global powers without becoming fully dependent on any single one. The war in Ukraine has highlighted this approach even further. India publicly stated that it supports peace and opposes armed conflict, recognizing that wars create economic instability far beyond the countries directly involved. However, when questioned about Western proposals to impose price caps on Russian oil, Indian officials carefully avoided giving a direct answer. Instead, they emphasized that India's responsibility is to secure energy supplies under the most favorable economic conditions for its own people. This position is highly pragmatic. India does not want to damage its relationship with Russia because discounted Russian oil has become an important source of affordable energy. At the same time, it also wants to preserve its growing partnerships with the United States and other Western economies. Rather than choosing one side, India is attempting to benefit from both. Energy lies at the center of this geopolitical balancing act. Throughout modern history, oil has repeatedly shaped international politics and global conflicts. The 1973 oil crisis demonstrated how dramatically energy markets can affect the world economy. When OPEC imposed an oil embargo on several Western countries, prices skyrocketed, inflation surged, and many economies entered severe recessions. Today, energy continues to play a similarly strategic role. In 2016, OPEC expanded by creating OPEC+, bringing together additional oil-producing countries, including Russia, to coordinate production policies and stabilize global oil markets. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the United States sought to lower global oil prices in order to reduce Russia's energy revenues. However, in October 2022, OPEC announced a production cut of 2 million barrels per day. With lower supply comes higher prices. The White House reacted sharply, arguing that the decision effectively benefited Russia by increasing oil revenues despite Western sanctions. The criticism was particularly significant because it was directed toward Saudi Arabia, one of America's oldest strategic partners and the largest producer within OPEC. For decades, the United States has viewed Saudi Arabia as a cornerstone of its Middle East security strategy. Yet Saudi Arabia increasingly finds itself balancing two equally important relationships. China has become its largest economic customer, purchasing roughly 1/5 of Saudi exports. Meanwhile, the United States remains its primary military and security partner. Choosing one relationship at the expense of the other would carry enormous economic and geopolitical cost. As a result, Saudi Arabia, like many other emerging powers, is pursuing a strategy that avoids full alignment with either bloc. This reflects a much broader transformation taking place around the world. Instead of dividing into two opposing camps as during the Cold War, many countries are adopting a more flexible foreign policy. Rather than choosing between Washington and Beijing, or between NATO and BRICS, they seek to maintain productive relationships with all major powers simultaneously. This emerging geopolitical landscape is often described as a multipolar world, one in which influence is distributed among several competing centers of power instead of being dominated by a single superpower. For many nations, this strategy offers significant advantages. By remaining economically and diplomatically valuable to multiple sides, countries can attract greater investment, negotiate stronger trade agreements, and reduce the risks associated with depending too heavily on any one global partner. However, maintaining this delicate balance is far from easy. History has shown that attempting to cooperate with competing powers can sometimes provoke political pressure or economic retaliation from both sides. As the rivalry between major powers continues to intensify, the ability of middle-sized nations to navigate this increasingly complex geopolitical environment may become one of the defining challenges of the coming decade. Part 4. Strategic Neutrality and India's Investment Potential. Turkey offers another clear example of this increasingly flexible foreign policy. The country is a member of NATO and voted in favor of condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. At the same time, however, it has maintained strong economic relations with Moscow and has shown interest in developing closer ties with BRICS. This may appear contradictory, but it reflects a strategy being adopted by a growing number of middle powers. These countries are not necessarily trying to abandon Western institutions, such as NATO, the G7, or the United Nations. Instead, they are attempting to maintain relationships with several competing powers at the same time. Rather than aligning permanently with one bloc, they seek to minimize political risks while maximizing economic opportunities. This strategy can be described as multi-alignment. A multi-aligned country tries to remain valuable to every major power. By doing so, it is more likely to receive investment, favorable trade agreements, diplomatic attention, and strategic cooperation. If both sides believe that a country could eventually move closer to their sphere of influence, they may offer better economic or political conditions to win its support. This approach also provides protection against uncertainty. Governments change, alliances evolve, and the foreign policy of a major power can shift dramatically after an election or political crisis. Maintaining relationships with several partners allows smaller nations to reduce the damage caused by sudden changes in global leadership. However, this strategy also carries serious risks. Cooperating too closely with one side can trigger retaliation from another. Turkey experienced this directly after purchasing Russia's S-400 air defense system in 2017. The decision conflicted with its position as a NATO member and ultimately resulted in Turkey being removed from the F-35 fighter jet program. This case demonstrates how difficult it can be to balance competing alliances. Even so, several influential investors and political thinkers have argued that the United States should preserve constructive relations with China rather than allowing competition to become permanent confrontation. India may be one of the countries navigating this geopolitical environment most successfully. It has maintained strong relationships with Western economies while continuing to participate in BRICS and purchase discounted energy from Russia. By avoiding complete dependence on any single bloc, India has been able to gain strategic and economic advantages from both sides. This balancing strategy is one reason India has become especially interesting from an investment perspective. India has enormous long-term potential. Its population is young, its domestic market is expanding, and millions of people are gradually entering the middle class. A larger working-age population can support greater consumption, higher productivity, and stronger economic growth. When a population grows and household incomes rise, demand usually increases across multiple industries, including banking, housing, transportation, technology, healthcare, consumer goods, and energy. This creates opportunities for companies to expand their revenues and profits over time. India's economic growth during the previous decade was already significant, and its demographic structure suggests that the country could remain one of the world's most important growth markets for years to come. However, investing in emerging markets always involves risks. Political uncertainty, legal protections, currency movements, regulation, corruption, and market transparency must all be carefully considered. India does not necessarily offer the same institutional stability as the world's most developed markets. But compared with many other emerging economies, its political and legal risks may be considered relatively moderate. International assessments have also placed major Indian companies among the stronger emerging market performers in areas such as transparency and corporate compliance. There are several ways investors can gain exposure to India. One possibility is purchasing shares in individual Indian companies. Some of the country's largest businesses operate in sectors such as financial services, information technology, energy, telecommunications, and consumer products. Another option is investing through a broader market index. The Nifty 50, for example, includes 50 of India's largest and most influential publicly traded companies. Investing through an index can provide greater diversification than selecting only one or two individual businesses. However, currency risk must also be considered. The Nifty 50 is measured in Indian rupees. If the rupee loses value against the US dollar, an international investor may receive a lower return in dollar terms, even when the Indian stock market performs well locally. This is why investors must evaluate both the performance of the underlying assets and the movement of the currency in which those assets are priced. As always, this information is provided for educational purposes only and should not be interpreted as a recommendation to buy or sell any investment. Before investing, every person should examine their financial goals, risk tolerance, time horizon, and personal circumstances. Part 5, Energy, Investment Opportunities, and the New Global Order. As the world moves toward an increasingly multipolar system, one industry stands above nearly every other in strategic importance. Energy. Energy has always been the foundation of economic growth. Every factory, transportation network, data center, and modern city depends on a stable and affordable supply of power. Throughout history, countries have competed for access to oil, natural gas, and other critical resources because controlling energy often means controlling economic influence. The conflict in Ukraine reminded governments around the world of a reality they had largely taken for granted. Energy security cannot be separated from national security. For decades, many countries relied heavily on imported fossil fuels, particularly natural gas and oil. But when geopolitical tensions disrupted global supply chains, energy prices surged, inflation accelerated, and governments began rethinking their long-term strategies. As a result, many nations are now investing aggressively in energy independence. Renewable energy has become one of the biggest beneficiaries of this global transformation. Solar power, wind energy, battery storage, hydrogen technologies, and modern electrical infrastructure are receiving unprecedented levels of public and private investment. Beyond reducing carbon emissions, these technologies help countries decrease their dependence on foreign energy suppliers and strengthen their long-term economic resilience. For many governments, renewable energy is no longer viewed solely as an environmental objective. It has become a geopolitical necessity. The European Union, for example, has accelerated its energy transition in an effort to reduce its reliance on Russian fossil fuels. Similar initiatives are taking place across North America, Asia, and many emerging markets. This shift is expected to generate enormous investment over the coming decades. For investors, this creates several possible opportunities. One approach is investing directly in companies focused on renewable energy technologies, including manufacturers of solar panels, wind turbines, battery systems, power management equipment, and clean energy infrastructure. However, there is an important consideration. Because renewable energy has attracted enormous investor attention, many companies in the sector already trade at relatively high valuations. High expectations can sometimes leave less room for future returns if business growth fails to meet optimistic forecasts. Another strategy involves looking beyond pure renewable companies. Many traditional energy, industrial, engineering, and utility businesses are investing billions of dollars into renewable projects, while continuing to generate stable cash flow from their existing operations. In some cases, these diversified companies may offer investors exposure to the long-term growth of clean energy without carrying the same valuation premiums as pure renewable energy businesses. Of course, every investment carries risk. Political decisions, technological innovation, regulation, interest rates, commodity prices, and global economic conditions can all significantly influence investment performance. That is why successful investing should never rely on headlines alone. Understanding how businesses generate profits, evaluating financial statements, assessing competitive advantages, and maintaining a long-term perspective remain essential regardless of current geopolitical events. Perhaps the biggest lesson from today's rapidly changing world is that global power is becoming increasingly decentralized. Rather than being dominated by a single superpower, the international system appears to be evolving toward multiple centers of influence. BRICS continues expanding its economic ambitions. Western nations continue strengthening their own alliances. Emerging economies are pursuing more independent foreign policies. Energy markets are being reshaped. Global supply chains are adapting. And investors are being forced to rethink assumptions that remained largely unchanged for decades. No one can predict exactly how this transformation will unfold, but history has consistently shown that periods of geopolitical change also create periods of extraordinary economic opportunity for those who understand the forces driving them. The key is not reacting emotionally to every headline. The key is staying informed, thinking independently, and making investment decisions based on careful research rather than short-term fear or excitement. The future will undoubtedly present new challenges. But for disciplined investors who remain patient, adaptable, and focused on long-term fundamentals, it may also present some of the greatest opportunities of our generation. If you enjoyed this analysis and want to better understand the powerful economic trends shaping the future, be sure to subscribe and join us for future videos. Every week, we break down complex global events, investment strategies, and the timeless principles used by some of history's greatest investors.